Hello, YouTube world, and hello soon those who are joining us live. My name is Logan. This is a GRE free prep hour. What we're going to do tonight is what we always do in our GRE free prep hours. So if you haven't seen any of our free prep hours before, here's what happens. We're going to do a lesson that's going to go up to an hour, might be shorter. After we do it live here, we're going to put it up on YouTube. There's a great playlist there of all of our other free prep hours that we've had. So if you haven't watched those, go check them out. We've got a lesson on almost every topic that exists on the GRE. Welcome. Who we got? Robin, Shannon, Sahidi in tonight. Just a moment. My dog just burst in with a very loud toy. That's why he's making I don't know what kind of noise you would call that, banging noises on the floor. Our topic for tonight is going to be sort of on the theme of the month we're in, which is October. We're going to talk about the spookiest problems on the GRE and how to identify them. What do I mean by that? By the spookiest problems, I'm talking about the hardest problems on the test. So tonight, we're not going to be really talking about a specific math topic or verbal topic in isolation and like how to get better at that topic. But I'm going to walk through some general ways that you can learn to identify the hardest problems on the test and why it's important to be able to identify the hardest problems on the test. And then we're going to do just a little bit of an exercise, actually trying it out with a set of verbal vocab problems and a set of math quantitative comparison problems, where I'm going to put 4 questions up on the screen. They're all from our practice tests, and they're going to be sort of ranked in difficulty from least to most difficult, and you are going to try to figure out, just from looking at them, what the difficulty levels are going to be. So that's our spooky themed Halloween lesson tonight. Welcome in all of you, and I hope this helps. If you haven't joined one of these before, there is a chat feature, so if you have any questions for me, you can send them my way anytime. I'll be sort of monitoring that. The question is, why do we care? Why do we care how hard the problem is? We got to cover that first before we get into how to identify the hardest and easiest questions. Well, if you haven't taken the GRE yet, or you're not very familiar with it, one of the first things you'll figure out when you do a practice test is that there's 20 questions per section. In between each section, you get a little bit of a time to take a breath, but each section is timed. What is the timing? Well, for a math section, you have 35 minutes, and on a verbal section, you have 30 minutes. But here's the thing. It's not like a lot of tests that you might have taken in middle school, high school, college. For me, back in those days, on most of my tests, the hard question was worth the most points. Maybe the hard question was worth 5 and the easy gimme question was worth 1. Not the case on the GRE. Every single question is worth the same, at least within a section. And there's going to be a whole range of difficulties within every section. There's going to be easy, medium, and hard questions in your first section. And then when you get into the second section, you might either get an easier set, a medium set, or a hard set. Depending on how well you did the first time, the better you do, the harder of a set you'll get, and the higher score band you'll be in. But even on that second set, if you're in the very hard section or the easier section, there will still be a range of difficulty, and it will pay to be able to identify the hardest ones because of our advice from our little ghost man down here. You want to get your easy points first. The easiest questions, they are your friend. And it's a little bit counterintuitive because in our head, the hardest stuff might be the most important. It might be the most satisfying when we get a hard one right. When we look at a hard question, we might be thinking, ooh, if I get this one, I really know what I'm doing. And that could be true. But here's the thing, the hard ones take longer. You only have 35 minutes on math, 30 minutes on verbal. And if you put that together, it's less than 2 minutes per question. So if you try a really hard one, which on both math or verbal could be something that takes you 3, 4, 5 minutes, what are you doing? You are losing time on all the rest of them. You're going to have to make up for it by going faster somewhere else. And until you get really high scoring at the test, that could be setting yourself up for failure if you take too long on very hard ones, and as a consequence, give yourself less time on average for the easier ones. Because here's the thing, one more thing that I'll add here. When you rush, you're way more likely to make mistakes. People say after they take a test and they're not super happy with how they did, whether it's a practice test or the real thing, they'll say, oh, I feel like I was making some silly mistakes. Everybody makes silly mistakes sometimes, so don't beat yourself up about that. But the more you accidentally start to rush because you spent too much time on hard questions, the more likely you're going to make those silly mistakes. And that's why I believe spending too much time on unfriendly problems is the #1 way to sort of mess yourself up on a section. If you picture yourself as having like a range of score outcomes, like let's say over here is your peak score. That's what you're hoping for. On your best day, you might hit that score. This is your bottom score. This is like the worst you're going to do given your skill level. Everybody has a range where on their best day, they're going to do better. On their worst day, they're going to do worse. And nobody's going to score the same thing every time because of luck, because of your performance that day, and because of any number of other things like how stressed are you about the rest of your life, how tired are you, how energized are you, stuff like that. Well, I think one of the most common things that causes students to wind up here, closer to the bottom of their score range, is if they really screw up their timing by doing something wrong in the timing early on in their sections, and then accidentally rushing through the rest of the section and sort of having it go off the rails, so to speak. Or go off track. Both of those train metaphors are things I hear a lot from students when they're like, dang, I can't believe I scored that much lower than I expected. What happened is that they scored at the bottom of their score range, a lot of times because of timing issues. And giving your time to the problems that you shouldn't have given that much time to, I think it's not the only way at all, but I think it's one of the most common ways that this happens. So this caution symbol here, this is a sign that I post a lot on the screen when I teach my GRE classes for Manhattan Prep. And a caution sign means when you see this question, you want to be careful. It doesn't mean you need to skip automatically. Though some teachers will say that you should learn what questions are hardest for you and skip them right away. I think that could work for some students. I don't generally tell everyone to do that. But what I do tell everyone to do is learn what the hardest questions are. Pardon my typos here. Learn what the hardest questions are. Picture them with a caution sign on them. And what the caution sign is saying is, hey, beware. If you start to take too much time, if you really don't know what to do here, just be aware this question is not your friend. It's going to suck you in for 3, 4, 5 minutes, and it might put you at risk of a test timing disaster. Let's start to talk about, what do we actually do? What do we actually do when we see a very hard question? We're going to spend the rest of the night talking about, well, how do we learn what questions are the hardest, and then actually practicing it with a few examples. But in order for you to put that into action, you got to know, what are you going to do on the hardest questions on the test? In general, here's what to do. leave a guess, mark it for review, and come back later. And that's actually something I didn't state earlier, but is very essential, along with the fact that all questions count the same, is that, take a look at this button. These are the buttons you have available to you when you're taking the GRE. This is a screenshot of the actual GRE interface. You can skip around within the section. That's not a given. There are some standardized tests where you can't do that, where you can only deal with the section, or excuse me, with the question that you have right in front of you. And once you move on, it's gone forever. On the GRE, it's not so. You've got your 20 question set. You can go forward, you can go backward, and you can use these pair of buttons that I have circled to. The mark button puts like a sort of literally a check mark is what shows up there. But it's kind of like if you were taking a paper test, putting a star on it. And then what the review button does is it brings you to a list of the 20 questions, and you can double click into the ones that you have marked. So what this does, use the mark and review buttons as a way, or basically to tell yourself what to go back to at the end if you have time. What you're doing here is you're saying, you know what, the time spent on this question, it's probably not my most valuable time, because I'm more likely to get this one wrong because of how hard it is. If you just joined, I think one or two people hopped in since the very beginning. What we're talking about tonight is how to identify and what to do on the very hardest questions. I can't teach you all the very hardest topics in tonight's hour, but we're going to talk about just in general on the test, how do you respond to the hardest questions? And using the mark and review buttons effectively is a great way to respond. Practice this in your practice tests. We're going to come back to this stuff that I've got down here. Let me kind of cover it up here. We'll come back to that stuff. But right now I want to talk about this. Your test day timing is a skill. And people usually know that. They know they have to practice their timing as well. But I want to really emphasize, before we even get into how to identify the hardest questions, how to actually build that skill, because building your timing skill is not easy. So a few notes: it obviously comes with practice. Just like every other skill on the test, you got to practice and learn from your mistakes in timing before you really get good at managing your steady pace. One actionable thing you can do that's a little bit less about identifying the hardest questions is learn to check the clock at certain intervals. Different people like to do this differently. A really simple one would be when you get to question 10, so halfway through the section, take a look at that clock. See whether you have more or less, than half of the time left. If you are behind schedule, you need to guess and skip a bit more the rest of the way. And a bit more really is just a bit. If you just guess and skip like 1 or 2 times on a question that you would have given a longer look if you weren't behind on schedule, then you've probably bought yourself back 2-3 minutes that you needed to get back on schedule. And this is the part that is really relevant to what we're talking about tonight. Learn to diagnose, that's the word we're going to be using, the hardest questions, so that you guess and skip on them more quickly. These are some of the ways you can actually improve your test day timing. There's other techniques you could use, but this is kind of an intro into leading us into, why does this matter? And by the way, if you didn't know, the reason why I keep saying guess and skip is that you should always leave a guess because there is no penalty for guessing. There is no negative points. So some standardized tests, I believe the SAT used to do this, so it got in a lot of people's heads that it's better to put no answer than to put a wrong answer, because a wrong answer might give you like minus a half point or something like that. Not so on the GRE. So no matter what, you always want to leave a guess for every answer. Even if you're not going to get to the end of the test and you have 10 seconds left, just hit next and guess until you hit the end, just so you at least have a chance, a random chance of getting all those ones that you didn't really try. Okay. So let's talk about this down here, because there's a couple different ways in which you might guess and skip. Sometimes it might be immediately. If you, well, not literally immediately, I guess. I mean, you have to read the question to know how hard it's going to be and how long it's going to take you. But you might do it almost immediately if you can already tell that it's going to be a very hard question for you, or a very time-consuming question for you. Or if you're someone who, you know, or I guess especially if you're someone who tends to run out of time, then you might especially want to do this. When you notice a certain question is going to be really tough, just guess, mark it for review, and get out of there. Don't give that unfriendly question any more time. However, the hard part is learning to do this, learning to get out of there after you've worked on it for a minute or two, because we all fall victim to sort of a sunk cost fallacy, which you likely have heard of at some point, right? A sunk cost fallacy is the idea that once you've put work into something, you have to keep going because you don't want to have basically wasted all the original work. And the reason we call it a fallacy is that very often it actually would be better to abandon the work you've already done if you've learned that it's not wise to continue, as opposed to just keep working on the same thing that you already know isn't working out. And I think that really happens for folks on the GRE. They get 1 or 2 minutes into a difficult question, especially a math question where you're writing out a lot of stuff, you're trying to solve that equation, trying to solve that word problem. And you feel like you got to keep going until you get the answer. And you can like taste the satisfaction when you get to the answer. That's very understandable, but sometimes you might be hurting your chances by doing that, because you might be condemning yourselves to 2 or 3 more minutes of work leading up to like 4 or 5 minutes total on a question that is not your friend because of your success rate, your likely success rate on that problem being lower. So one of the hard skills that we'll try to talk about a little bit when I show you some actual questions in a bit is like, yeah, how can you sort of learn to get out when the going gets tough as you're solving and not always push through until you get an answer. I hope I don't sound too repetitive so far. I'm trying to really reiterate a few of these key points because this goes very contrary to the way our brains want to work on the test. We see a question, we want to get it right. And it feels like we should be trying to get every question right to get the best score. But the sad truth is, because of that time limit and because of the fact that almost every test taker is going to struggle with timing at some point. I've scored very, very well on the GRE, but I still struggle with timing. It's hard for me to manage the clock on this test. So all score ranges will run into this difficulty of needing to guess and come back on certain questions. One of the things that the best test takers do is they can reduce their number of wrong answers by not giving the time to the ones that they were going to get wrong anyway. Okay, let's actually talk for a few minutes about what makes a math question hard and what makes a verbal question hard, and then we'll look at some examples. And by the way, if you guys have any questions, like I said, definitely let me know in the chat. So we are going to do quant first. And I'm going to just run through statistically some of the hardest quant topics and formats. And even if you are a great test taker, you are not immune to these statistics. So no matter how high of a scorer you are, these problem types are statistically more difficult. So you should at least be aware of their difficulty level. One of them is pick all that apply. Why is that statistically so difficult? It's because there is no partial credit. So if you have to pick multiple answers, it means that it's not just type, get the right answer, plug it in. I think I said that kind of backwards. You're not really typing as you solve unless you use calculator. Right, get the right answer, click it in. It's not just that. You have to test every single answer and decide yes or no. And that means way more chances to get one of the answer choices wrong. And because they don't give partial credit, you either get the full question right or wrong. Anytime you have to sort of submit multiple answers, it's going to be harder. The next one. Complicated word problems with unusual setups. An unusual, that's kind of a vague word, but basically a setup that you can't easily tell right from the get-go. And just a note on this, there's a fine line between what's the most difficult and what's the most time-consuming one. The most difficult questions tend to be more time-consuming. But what really makes these scary, the reason why these get a big old caution sign from me, and why I think word problems are kind of a common place where things go wrong. These are usually time-consuming, even when they are easy. Like even when it's an easy version of a complicated word problem, it's probably going to take a while to do it, and that makes it risky. And this next thing applies there too. Oops, I forgot my arrangement. I'm going to have to move my caution sign. We got problems with a lot of calculation or algebra steps. And that applies to word problems as well. It can also apply to certain problems in most types of math, fractions, percents, geometry, exponents. Any type of problem, they might give you a version of it where you have to do 1 or 2 steps writing in your notebook. They might give you a version where you have to do 4 or 5 or 6 steps. The more steps, the more chances there are for you to mess up, usually. So this is another lever that the test makers pull to make a problem harder or easier, is how many steps of calculation does it take. Let's keep going. And then in math, this one, some of the stuff I mentioned, like pick all that apply, is going to apply for verbal as well, but this one's really math specific. In math, on the GRE, there's just a lot of topics that are on the table, and the most advanced and rare topics are statistically going to be more difficult because it's less likely that you studied them, and they might just be more difficult topics. So some examples that I just came up with quickly include probability, combinatorics, 3D shapes, parabolas, nested figures, which is usually when it's like a triangle inside of a circle or a rectangle inside of a triangle or something like that. And there's a bunch of other ones that fall into like the most advanced and rare topics list that I could put up here. As you study, it's a good idea to really make sure you master the fundamentals first, because those are the things you need to be good at over and over and over. The key fundamentals that I would say are there on math: fractions, percents, algebra and solving equations. So what we call often number properties, which is basically understanding prime numbers, exponents, divisibility, the other core things about like how numbers just work. The basics of geometry, which are like circles, triangles, lines, and angles. And then the basics of statistics, which includes like reading graphs, being able to calculate mean and median. That stuff I just mentioned covers a really strong portion of the test. And if you're great at those things, you're going to have a pretty good score floor. There's tons of other things, including the stuff I've listed here and others that you'll run into when studying, but you'll notice you only run into them every once in a while. Well, if you run into them on the test, you can be sure that problem is likely to be statistically harder. So you might want to guess and skip, especially if you personally are not that familiar with that topic. If you are just like a random probability whiz, you know, by all means, go for it. And that brings me to my last point, which is that this also has a personal side to it. The stuff that I'm saying so far, these are what makes questions more difficult on average. But there's a difference for each test taker. Different test takers have different strengths and weaknesses that don't always perfectly match the average test taker. So you might be great at some of the topics that are technically more advanced. You might be not so great at one or two of the more fundamental topics. And that is all okay, right? But what helps is to know what your strengths and weaknesses are, and to know when you are on a problem that is going to be really tough for you. So definitely, I encourage you, put time into understanding your strengths and weaknesses, and make, going off screen here, make guess and skip decisions based on that. Like, for example, I've heard from several of my fellow Manhattan Prep teachers who all score very well that they just totally skip certain types the first time they see them. They might automatically skip cylinders. They might automatically skip rates questions. Those are some that I've heard. Probability is one that I've heard, because they know that's a weakness for them personally. For me, I actually like most of the stuff I just mentioned, but I randomly hate a couple of the technically less advanced topics, such as absolute value. Absolute value always messes me up. And so do a lot of inequalities questions generally. So when I see them, I often will say, you know what, if I'm struggling, I'm going to guess and come back. And that helps me basically make the most of my time. Let's talk about verbal. And then after that, we're finally going to look at some real questions. What makes a verbal question hard? Excuse me. Well, once again, pick all that apply is a big one. Here, I'll do this time. We'll make a little highlight bar. Pick all that apply. Same reason. Partial credit does not exist. So if you have the option of picking multiple answers, it's going to be tougher to get the whole problem right. The same thing is true for text completion, which is the vocab type where you're filling in the blank. Oftentimes there's going to be just one blank, but oftentimes there are going to be multiple blanks. And if you have two and especially three blanks, it just gets harder. And so those are things where you might want to guess and skip if you're going to run out of time. Let me make a quick add-on note here because I should have included it before. Also, vocab questions with harder vocab words or longer, more complicated sentences. If you've done some of the GRE before, you know these vocab fill-in-the-blank questions, they are not all created equal in terms of how hard the words are. Sometimes the words that you're filling in are frankly very normal everyday words. Sometimes they're words where you're like, no one would ever use that word. I'm not even sure what it means. Clearly, the harder the words, the harder on average the question is going to be. And the same is true for a longer, more complicated sentence. Doesn't mean you can't have hard vocab words in an easier question, but again, just on average. This is one that's a little less obvious. If you have a question that says something like, all of these are supported by the passage except which one? Most reading questions, you have to find proof of one answer. Here, you have to find proof of all 4 incorrect answers. So this is actually possibly the most time-consuming type, because your job is to find 4, there's usually 5 options on reading comprehension. And in this type of question, your job is to find 4 of them that are proven, which means you have literally 4 times as many pieces of information to find in the passage. And so at first glance, these aren't always the hardest questions, but they are very time consuming. And then last but not least, for sure, is once per test, you're going to get a passage that's way longer than all the others. Most passages are 1 or maybe 2 short paragraphs. Once per GRE, you will see a reading comp passage that is more like 3 or 4 paragraphs, and they can throw people for a loop timing wise. It's hard to deal with them, and exactly how to deal with them isn't the topic of tonight. Some of the short answer versions are get good at understanding the big picture and get good at remembering where those details are, because there's no room in your head for all the details once you get a very long passage. But those, again, they're statistically harder and more time consuming, because not only is there more to read, but it's harder to go back and find the stuff that you read in a very long passage. And I should have also added very dense passages. As you get into the GRE, you will also learn some passages feel fine to read. Some passages make you hate the English language as you read them. And if you're on one of those where it's hard to tell what every sentence is saying, where it's very convoluted sentence structure, or lots of difficult vocab words in the passage, or just a very complicated scenario that's being described, that's going to make the questions more difficult as well. And then the same thing as in math, just do be aware of your own strengths and weaknesses in verbal. Now, in verbal, this is a little bit less actionable of a tip, because there's not as many different topics you have to learn on verbal, right? It's more about the formats of the questions. So still, you might learn which formats you're best and worst at. And also sort of the topics of the passages themselves, but there's no way you can prepare yourselves for the topics. So it's good for you to know in general, okay, I'm better at arts passages than science passages, or I'm better at history passages than I am, I don't know, economics passages. It's good to kind of know that. But since they tend to ask you multiple questions per passage, you never want to completely bail on a passage just because you don't like the topic, right? But it is good to know your own strengths and weaknesses. All right, we got 25 minutes left, which means we should have 10 minutes or so to look at each of the next 2 slides, which are going to be looking at 4 math questions and trying to figure out how hard each one is, or rank them on difficulty, and then looking at 4 vocab questions. Now, I'll confess, the stuff that I've said so far about how to figure out what makes a question hard or easy is not going to be, we are not going to be able to use all that stuff in what we're about to look at, because not all the stuff I mentioned is even here. But here are 4 quant questions, and they all follow a certain format. And if you haven't seen the format before, let me quickly go through it. It's called quantitative comparison. And your job in these questions is to figure out between these four options for all of these. A means quantity A is greater. B means quantity B is greater. So the main job here is to figure out which side, quantity A or B, is the larger, greater quantity. It's possible, answer choice C for all of these. Quantities A and B are equal. And it's possible, D, that there's not enough info to determine. The exact phrasing is different than what I just wrote, but basically it's not enough information. I don't want you to worry too much right now about solving all of these, though certainly do work on that if you want. What I want you to do, those of you who are here live, is take 2 or 3 minutes, and I want you to try to guess which of these is the hardest to the easiest. So type this in the chat. Send me your guess, 1 to 4, rank each one, or rank them 1 to 4 from easiest to most difficult. Yeah, take a few minutes, look these over, think about what makes some of them statistically harder or easier than others. If ranking all 4 of them is feeling tough, you can also just send me what's your guess on which of these is technically the hardest and which of these is technically the easiest. Oh, sorry, y'all. I think I have the chat features wrong. Okay, now you should be able to chat to me. I saw that answers were coming in through the Q&A board. If you go to the chat button, you should now have the option to chat with, it'll say hosts and panelists, and that'll be just to me. All right, thank you, Sahidi. Thank you, Robin. Thank you, Shannon. Thank you, Lataiha. Got lots of good submissions in here. And I'm going to sort of reveal them one by one and then just talk a little bit about why I think these rankings are what they are. And by the way, for a little bit about how I pulled these questions, these are from the MPrep practice tests. And we have sort of a tiered difficulty level system. These are at 4 different points of the difficulty rankings. basically. The reason why problems are both in our materials and on the official GRE, problems are also ranked on a difficulty scale, not when you see them, but according to the GRE, they're actually ranked from 1 to 5. And they do that because they give different sort of difficulty distributions in that second section, depending on how you did in the first one. So they like to know how difficult each question is. And y'all pointed out the easiest question on this board is the last one. Why do you think, tell me in the chat, why is this one the easiest? Several of you mentioned this as the easiest one. What makes it so straightforward? This is going to get us into some of the other ways that the tests make things harder or easier. Yeah, Sahidi says, you can actually just solve for these. So some things that I think make this easier compared to the other ones on this board. No variables. Only one type of math is really going on here, percents. We don't really have to do a mix of different types of things. So when I look at this, I know pretty quickly that this is going to be towards the easier end. And then I'll say one other thing is, if you're sharp on your percentage calculations, you can do this in the calculator quickly. Then the next easiest is this one. And I purposefully included 2 geometries and 2 sort of in the fractions percents realm, because if we were to have more time tonight and really dive in here, it would be great to look at every type of question and look at easy, medium, hard. Like what do they change? What levers do they pull to change the difficulty? But a few things here that start to get it a little bit harder is we have variables, or we have a variable. We have a mix of percents and fractions. And then one more thing is we have given information to deal with. Down here, we have quantity A and we have quantity B, but we didn't have any of what we call the given information, which is like the rules of the problem stated up front. Most questions have given information, and it's not a bad thing if they do that. It's usually telling you something about what to do. You can use it as a clue. But if there's no given information, that's still usually a nice thing, because it means you can kind of do whatever you want. And that can make your calculation life easier. Yeah. So this one is easier than these two, but not the easiest on the board. Okay, and over here between these two, first off, I think it's pretty clear that these two, on average, again, you might be someone who really struggles with percents and fractions, but you're a geometry whiz. That happens. So I'm not trying to say anything about every single person's difficulty experience. But on average, these over here are going to be more difficult. Why is that? We have geometry which involves sort of remembering formulas, and there's a formula you need to remember for both of these. And in fact, both of these are towards the pretty hard end of the spectrum, because cylinders are towards the hard end of the spectrum, and trapezoids, I didn't call this out earlier, but irregular polygons, I'm not sure if I'm using that word correctly, but basically polygons other than triangles and rectangles, those are also in the more difficult end of the GRE spectrum. I tell you what, I think these two are very close between them. But according to our practice tests, this one down here is actually ranked as the hardest. And these come from the difficulty rankings are also informed by statistically how many people got them right. So I believe that this one down here had a lower percentage of people get it right. Any theories in the chat between these two? Acknowledging that they're both pretty hard, questions. Do you notice anything that could maybe make this one, here a little easier than the one below on average? What do you think? If that's hard to know, understood, because you could have studied for the GRE a while and not even necessarily run into these two things, being cylinders and trapezoids much. I got a good note in the chat here. Someone mentioned making a guess. And I do think there's something about this one that gives us a room to guess, a room to not exactly guess, but not just guess between A, B, C, and D, but we can pick a number for the radius and the height. We don't have time tonight to talk about all the ways picking numbers is one of the most common GRE strategies. But you're going to be doing a lot on the GRE of looking at a question and saying, you know what? I think I can decide for myself what size this shape is, or how fast that truck was going, or what X is. Why? In this case, because they only told us a ratio, 2/3 the height. And quick tip for other problems, if they ever only give you a percentage or a ratio or a fraction, and they didn't say anything about a solid number, that's often a hint that you can pick a number. So here, if I were to summarize, I'd say what's working against us here, we might not remember the cylinder formula for surface area of the caps or of the curved surface. But what's good? If we do remember, we can pick numbers and go from there. So for example, we might pick radius 2, height 3. That would be the easiest way to have the radius be 2/3 of the height. So even though we have something really working against us in terms of the topic, we have something working in our favor in terms of the tools available to us. Down here, the reason why I suspect a less portion of people got this one correct is we might not know the trapezoid area formula. And if we do know it, we are missing a piece. It turns out the trapezoid area is half of base 1. I shouldn't type this. This is not a very typable one. It's the height times base 1 plus base 2 over 2. Well, we have the height, we have base 1, we don't have base 2. We don't know this opposite length. So we are going to have to do work to find all the pieces we need. As opposed to in the one in the top left, if we know the formula, we can just plug and chug any old number we think of, and we can get there. Here, not only do we need to remember this, we need to run through a whole process to even find one of the missing pieces. And when I start to see this, it's a geometry, and there's a very key formula or very key piece of the formula missing, and I don't use trapezoids much, so I'm not very practiced at finding the side of a trapezoid. I start to not be so confident about how to do that one. Okay. For those of you on YouTube, if you want to know how to solve any of these, give us a chat comment, and we'll pop in chat comment. That's not what you call it on YouTube. Leave a comment, and we'll pop in with some explanations in the comment replies. We only have about 10 minutes left though, so I want to do this same exercise for vocab. Let's look at 4 vocab questions. This time, the correct answers are actually already revealed. But again, I want you to take 2-3 minutes, look over these questions, and then send me in the chat, what do you think is the hardest one? What do you think is easy? Oh my gosh, the answers are already up here, aren't they? I went 2 slides ahead instead of 1. Take a look at these. Even though you've seen it, send me your best guess. What would be the hardest questions? Oh, probably your guesses will be correct. Well, since I went and spoilered my own slide, I'll go ahead and start going through these and talking again about why some of them are classified as easier or harder than others, and how you could maybe learn from this in your own vocab problems when you're taking a look at them. Top right, that's the easiest on this slide. How come? Well, just one blank. The sentence is short-ish. You know, sometimes they get longer. If you look at the top left, for example, that's quite a bit longer sentence. And the answers are not super easy, but they aren't the hardest words either. And one other thing I want to highlight briefly is that we have pretty good match words here. The answer to this question, this is talking about how the rural population was something, and that thing was the result of, and it was the result of trade routes and immigration that brought a patchwork of settlers from far-flung lands. What do those things tell me? There's going to be a lot of difference or variety, let's say. Because they're coming from all over the place. It's a patchwork, which means there's like a bunch of little different types of things. And that's part of what leads to the correct answer of heterogeneous. And these things here of clear pivot words, where it's telling us, okay, are we going to match, is the blank going to match something or oppose it? And clear evidence words, an easier question will be structured such that there are more straightforward of words like the result of that tell you what to look for. And then clearer evidence words as well, like patchwork and far-flung lands that tell you the fact you need to know. In more difficult questions, one thing that might happen is that the evidence might be more spread out throughout the sentence. And then I guess one other thing would be that none of the answers are particularly similar to the right answer. So I won't go through all the definitions, but none of these definitions here are super close to heterogeneous, which means lots of variety. But in a more difficult version of this question, there would be another word that was close, but not quite. So I mentioned earlier that one of the big ways to make a problem more difficult is multiple blanks, but it turns out this 2-blanker is not one of the hardest ones on the slide. It was ranked towards the easier end, but not all the way towards the easiest end in our data. And I think that it's 2 blanks, so that makes it automatically not one of the easiest. But those 2 blanks have a clear relationship. Similar to how the result of gave us a big clue over there. If you've had a chance to read through this one, you'll see we're talking about 2 researchers where not only were their results not, but the 2 sets of results were something. So we know, and this helps us have a more straightforward, confident answer to this question. We know these blanks need to be opposites. Being in accord means like being in agreement. Irreconcilable means impossible to agree, right? The only correct answer could involve a clear pair opposite there. So if you notice a 2-blanker that has a clear relationship like this, you could say, okay, this might be a 2-blanker, but it's going to be towards the easier end within the 2-blank realm. Let's talk about this one. Hold on. There we go. As you all saw earlier, this one is not the hardest, but is toward the harder end. Let's compare it to the other 1-blanker on the screen. And it's interesting to see that the words in the blank here, I don't think are the even necessarily as hard as these, or maybe they're similar to these. But I think what we have here is a sentence that doesn't have quite as clear evidence words. We do have in the form of, right, which could maybe be telling us that the follow-up is going to match. And then we have open-ended, which is a pretty good match for qualitative. So why would less people be getting this one right? I think a lot of it might have to do with the wrong answers. We have an opposite. There's a lot of opposites, which sounds like it might make it easier, but statistically, a lot of people pick the opposites. And then if we look at some of these other blanks, some of them are ones that if you sort of read back the sentence, especially I think valuable, if you just read that sentence without looking at the word qualitative, I think valuable could make a lot of sense. So we have more tempting wrong answer choices here. A good reminder that vocab difficulty is not always what makes a sentence technically more difficult. And very last, thanks for staying here, y'all. It's about 9 p.m. where I am on the East Coast, so we're about to wrap up. But this one over here is the hardest one on the page for all the reasons you might think. It is a multi-blanker. It is hard vocab words. And it is hard vocab words in the answers. And it's also a sort of more dense sentence with vocab words. You know, we have words up there like vivify and brigands, not words you use every day. Words down here like rave and remonstrate. I actually recently saw this question and hadn't seen it before, and I got it wrong because I didn't know the difference between rave and remonstrate. So this is what a hard vocab question will feel like. Hard words in the sentence as well, and likely multiple blanks. Okay, so that was our hour talking about, we lost the Halloween theme after the first 5 minutes, sorry, but talking about, like I said, the spookiest problem types on the test. So obviously we haven't covered it all because there's whole types of questions we didn't look at in the samples that we just did. But I hope this helped in sort of just starting to think about diagnosing the most difficult questions and starting to look at, in those 4 quadrant examples I did, what are the different dials that the test makers turn to make a question more difficult? And when you're on a question and you're like, you know what, I think those dials are turned up to 9 or 10 or 11 on the difficulty scale, what are you going to do? Think back to that, why we do this slide. You're going to consider guessing, skipping, coming back at the end if you have time, because your time is so precious and you don't want to spend it. You don't want to spend your 30 minutes trying to remember the difference between remonstrate or rave, or trying to remember what's the formula for a trapezoid and banging your head against the wall to solve that trapezoid question. You want to spend it moving on to the easier, more friendly questions that we looked at, and making sure you aren't making too many mistakes there because of being in a rush. All right, thanks y'all. I hope this was helpful for those of y'all who are here. And I hope this was helpful for those of you watching on YouTube as well. Like I said, I know it could be frustrating. We didn't actually solve all those questions on the screen for math. So let us know in the comments if you want some tips on how to do this. And have a good night. See you all for the next prep hour.